Hello, everybody. I know there are lots of people invisible who are friends, and I wish I could see you and greet you all. But anyway, I thought it might be a good idea to do this, mainly just really to listen rather than what we talk about, to listen to Casals play, because I find I'm often taken really by surprise when I'm coaching in Chamber Studio or Guildhall or various places where I teach. When I slightly casually ask people if they've ever heard Casals, which seems to me a rather surprising question to need to ask, and so often they say they have never ever heard Casals. I mean, 20-year-old cellists, student cellists, and I realise this is actually quite normal. I mean, it feels abnormal to me, but it's actually quite common, and it's interesting because when I was student age, a lot of people I knew used to trawl around specialist record shops especially in London, and there were one or two places which had ancient LPs, long playing records of old performances, and it would take hours to go there and rifle through the shop and try and find something that you thought was interesting, and then you'd be thrilled if you found, I don't know, Fort Wrangler conducting a Pathétique, or Lipati playing some Chopin, or Cortot playing something, or Thibaut, or names who were sort of legends, but one didn't know too much about, and then you rush home and play it, and half the time the record wouldn't really work, or it was so crackly you couldn't hear anything, and there was just a risk one took. But from time to time one struck absolute gold, and it was thrilling. And now that absolutely everything is on YouTube, and it's completely effortless to find these things, I think, like everything which is very easy to find, somehow people are possibly not doing it because it's too easy and one could always do it tomorrow. and tomorrow never quite happens. So anyway, I've no idea amongst the panelists how many of you have or have not heard these players. I suspect because you're on the panel, you do listen to these players and you are interested, but many are not, and I'm sure everyone's interested once they hear it. But anyway, I think it's very important, and it's very important also to say this is not so that we in any way start studying the way an old master plays the piece which we are playing. In fact, quite the reverse. I think it's important to say, if you're learning a piece, the last thing you should do, the very last thing you should do, is listen to a recording of it. And I think it should be just you and the score having a new relationship and striking up a new, finding a new way through just relating to the score. So the purpose of it is not to help you play a piece, and it's actually good to listen to great players of other instruments rather than your own. But the purpose is just to get to widen our imagination for what sort of playing is possible and how much can be achieved, and differences in performance cultures which are hugely different from what is considered normal today. And it's really just to widen our imagination, and also for sheer enjoyment of what they do. I mean, it would be impossible to imagine an instrument maker who wasn't interested in studying Stradivarius and Guarnerius instruments, or actually it's not so impossible to imagine a composer who's not interested in studying Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, because there are some. But I must say, I struggle with those composers. I mean, the composers who I relate to today are the ones who just find it absolutely natural to study the great composers of the past. So I think it's for us as players equally natural to study great playing, great singing, great conducting of the past. And we might disagree what is great playing, great conducting of the past, but I would just propose for today Pablo Casals. I also have a slightly personal connection, very glancing personal connection, but when I was about 11 or 12, my mum was asked by a cellist in Yorkshire if my mum would play with her in masterclasses that Casals was given in Zermatt. And because of that, my whole family made the long trek to Zermatt and listened to Casals teaching for 2 or 3 weeks in the masterclass. And my sisters actually, who are older than me, played in, there was a piano class and there was a violin class given by somebody called Chandor Vague, who in that course, I don't think I once went to listen to his class, and nobody sort of mentioned him because it was all about Casals. Vague later, of course, became a huge figure in my life and helped founded Prussia Cove, where so many of us go and study and spend time there. And he always said that he was transformed as a player by Casals. And of course, there's a big relationship between Casals, what Casals would teach and what Vague would teach. Anyway, it was completely wonderful. And my first memory of seeing Casals was sitting there as a young boy, waiting very excitedly for him to come in. And then this very, very old little man coming in with great difficulty on the arm of his new wife, who was this radiantly beautiful 19-year-old Puerto Rican beauty, and who was, you know, helping him along and carrying his cello, and she sat him down on a chair and sort of helped him off with his coat, and then she got his cello out and she tuned it up and she tightened his bow, and I was thinking, oh no, he can't do anything because and then she handed him the cello, and then he just played the open strings, and it was the most incredible sound I've ever heard. It was just the most thrillingly vibrant, deep, warm sound, just playing a fifth on the open strings. It was amazing how he produced sound, and his energy and vigor as a teacher was astonishing. I mean, he wasn't, I would say, he wasn't a great analytic teacher. There was a lot of grunting and gesture and just using very ordinary words, but saying them with such force and with such feeling that they meant everything. And his demonstrations were memorable. I'll never forget the way he played certain movements of Bach D minor suite, and that they're burnt into my memory. Anyway, so I just thought we'd start with a little Haydn piece. All my selection of pieces is that they're all arrangements, I'm afraid, apart from the final one, and they're all short pieces, partly because of ease of us listening, and partly because I think he plays short pieces extraordinarily well in his characterization, and it's a very good way of getting into his art. So the first one is actually written for violin and viola. It's a little minuet by Haydn, which is then varied. It's actually a set of variations on a minuet theme. And I knew this record from about the age of 3. It was on the back of a record of Colney Ray, and this was my favorite record for about 4 months. I must have played it about 12 times a day, every day for ages. And I absolutely adored this piece. So this is partly for me just a nostalgic reliving of something that I loved and have never ceased to love. So for me on my computer, which normally plays that very in quite good quality from YouTube, it's the sound is a little bit sometimes underwater, and I think it's just the quality of Zoom, which is a shame. But I think you've all got the links. So if you want to hear it probably in better quality, then I think if you listen to it afterwards on your own without 50, 60 other people listening to it, I imagine the quality will be better. But nevertheless, what are people's reactions to that?
I'll go first.
Well done, you're brave.
I think even with the, I could tell that the quality wasn't what it should be, but you still hear this incredible depth of sound all across the range. And you hear it throughout the opening kind of simple theme, and then through the variation, there's always this like amazing quality to his sound. That it doesn't really matter what happens with the internet. You can just hear it, it's still there. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think there are many, many different sounds, of course, but I think one feature of his, if there's anything general, is that there was always a real core to the sound. He didn't use lots of bow. It was never floating around the fingerboard. I mean, he had so many different ways of playing piano and pianissimo, but there was always a sense of enunciating clearly. He was wonderful at speaking in music as well as singing in music. It's a strange mixture of speaking and singing, but the small notes are always, the diction is always extraordinary. I love just the relationship between his upbeats and downbeats. If you just in the first 8 bars, the affectionate character comes out of the way he joins the first upbeat to the downbeat. And when he has a group of notes, even 2 notes, they're never quite equal in time, and a group of 4 notes. So actually, maybe, Richard, if we could, sorry to land you in this, if we could just hear the first 8 bars again,
Yeah.
just from the beginning, because that has all these features. Oh, that's a nice cat. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, the wonderful way he joins the upbeat to the downbeat at the beginning sets the tone. But actually, I've never seen the score of this. I was looking for it earlier today and I couldn't find it. But I suspect that the F and the E are just two quavers, and it almost sounds like a dotted quaver and a semiquaver the way he plays it. And then the next upbeat, which I would imagine is the same time value. And there's a different relationship between those. But meanwhile, the pianist is absolutely clockwork, and his rubato is very much in tempo. He often talked about freedom, yes, but discipline or order. He said that was how democracy should be and how music should be and how life should be. So I think that's a very good example of that. Does anyone else want to? Yes.
Theo's there.
Yes. I like how, well, what we would consider today as that kind of playing with the shifting and the vibrato would be very kind of, for Haydn, quite tasteless and not very well sort of researched, and not in a very kind of historically performed style, but actually the way he does it, you kind of don't want it to sound any other way, because he sort of convinces you that that is a really good way of kind of approaching it. And obviously that was much more of the style back then, I guess. But
yeah,
I love how you don't immediately think, oh god, that sounds really kind of schmaltzy or something straight away. You just think, oh, that sounds amazing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the vibrato and the shifts are all extremely considered. I mean, they're all totally coming from the music. I mean, I think there is a lot of playing of those days. In fact, most cello playing of those days has a lot of shifts which I feel are not coming from the heart and are just coming from the fingers, as Stephen Nislis often says. Whereas I think every shift here is there for a reason, and the vibrato is very restrained. I mean, when he's phrasing off, he does less vibrato. It's not a continuous element just beautifying the sound for its own sake. And I must say, I never feel in any way emotionally manipulated. I never feel as if he's trying to make it beautiful or trying to make me moved. It just is what it is, and it's incredibly moving. But it's something very simple and a pure statement, something quite peasant-like, I think, about the way he approaches it. Just a simplicity. And I think that's what stops it. That's what stops one worrying about whether, you know, this is how they played. I mean, there's a huge discussion to be had about how much we really know about how they played and whether there was such a thing of how they played, because there are thousands and thousands of cellists and there was no globalization and no recording. So in every little village, people played differently. But I think the important thing is whether the expressive tools that Casals brings to it are drawing out the soul of the music or getting in the way of the soul of the music. And I think your reaction, I love your reaction, because I mean, you know it's not how we would play, and it's quite possibly not how they might have played, but it just feels so natural that it's not getting in the way of the music at all. It's possibly enhancing it. Yeah. Should we listen to another one? Okay. So the next one is a lot of Casals' recordings are made as a very old man, and not only as an old man, but an old man who wasn't performing very much or practicing very much. I'll come to that later, but he stopped touring the world performing at a certain point in his life, soon after 1945. And a lot of the recordings are slightly I mean, I almost love them for their vulnerabilities, but they're very different from the next one. The Chopin Nocturne shows a cellist who was a phenomenal cellist, and there's a lot of virtuosity in the Haydn we just heard, but it's not the sort of virtuosity where people are sort of putting huge amount of energy and going very fast and shaking their heads about it. There's an elegance and simplicity, virtuosity, which is not advertising itself. In the Chopin, there's a virtuosity which is unmissable, and in a way it is advertising itself, but it's for all the cellists in the audience, it's completely astonishing. It's also just, you know, again, wonderfully turned phrasing and absolutely natural sounding phrasing. So yes, I mean, this is outrageous to make an arrangement of a piece which is so perfect on the piano, and but it's also just so wonderful to hear Casals approaching this piece. Well, it's a shame. I presume we're all having the same problem, issues with the sound. And it's a shame. One thing we're missing, but again, you'll be able to hear it if you go on your own afterwards onto YouTube. Is he's one of the things he said quite often teaching is and conducting is diminuendo is the life of music, and he was very keen on the after accents and in the breathing of music that one should be able to diminuendo, but his diminuendos were so subtle. They didn't sound like diminuendos, and nor should they, when they're sort of half phrase endings and even phrase endings, and even less should they be writs, which but the music does have to breathe. And he just had such mastery of the bow. Chrysler called him the monarch of the bow. That just the way he would handle a longer note, and it would just something in the bow speed, and also which the left hand would then reflect, would just make the note breathe. And all his long notes have a shape. They're never just a flat note. They're always either leading forward to the next note, or they're just gently phrasing off. But they're always part of the design of the phrase. And there's never anything automatic about just a sustained sound. And whether it's in pianissimo or fortissimo, it's the same. There is that. There are hills and valleys and rainbows within the phrasing. You can also hear in the Chopin again a lot of these notes where he's speaking through them. The articulation is. The bow doesn't stop and the vibrato doesn't stop, but there's some slight pulsation in the bow, which gives a perfect speaking sound, which, as I said, is very, very characteristic of what he does. The treble range and the bass range sounds so utterly different. I mean, it really sounds. His mother was a singer. And it just sounds like a singer when he's at the highest ranges of the cello. Bear in mind also that in those days recordings were not so important. They were just something you did, but it was just a little. They were just starting really. I think he wouldn't have imagined that 180 years later we would be sitting listening to these things, and that they were all done in one take. I mean, I suppose he might have had 2 or 3 goes at it, but there was no splicing or correcting. And so if you hear the odd note, which today would be easily changed by an editor, that's just because the whole thing was in one take, and including the concertos and the longer pieces. So which in many ways benefits the recordings. It makes them much more alive, even if there's the odd note which he might not have wanted. It'd be quite no, maybe I'll leave that till later. I'd quite like to talk about his intonation actually. But let's just listen to one more thing, and then you tell me a bit more about what you're thinking. So we're going to listen to, this is very short, Dvorak, Songs My Mother Taught Me. I'm sorry, so many of these are just beautiful, slow songs. Mm. Well, we're still, and I hope something is coming over. We're still losing it, and how wonderful it is when he, after the intensification in the phrase, the way he relaxes it is really being lost, because on the diminuendo, Zoom doesn't like diminuendo, I'm afraid. Anyway, tell me some more of your thoughts.
Cindy.
Yeah, I was listening. The way he varied every time he did that octave down in that song, or in that piece. And I mean, in general, there's something quite incredible with his lightness and poise, which I think comes from some of that, the way he handles time, the way he handles rubato, the way he handles registers. And so there's a sort of strictness and a lightness. I was thinking that in every piece from the Haydn onwards. I mean, someone mentioned the lack of, the different approach to sort of what we would nowadays call historical informed playing. And I was thinking from the first piece, like, oh, there's an incredible lightness to what he does, and how is he achieving it? But I think it's got something to do with what you talk about, the diminuendos he does, the way he phrases incredibly subtly, and the way he handles time, so that it's poised but timeless.
Very well put. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's lovely that Cindy talks there about the kind of paradox of what Julia was saying before about depth of sound, depth of tone, and yet actually what comes out is this wonderful lightness.
Yes, I think technically, as far as I can hear, and I can't remember much because it was an awful long time ago, but although he in general used very little bow and it was nearest to the bridge, it was not with pressure. I mean, he wasn't actually pressing down hard onto the bow at all. He was just using the natural, what the bridge gives you. And so somehow his cello, every string, he managed to have its own flavour. And the flavour wasn't, every string was a different voice, really. And it wasn't drowned by, all-purpose vibrato or all-purpose pressure. And there's something very simple and natural about it, but it's also incredibly, the refined is like the last word I would apply to Casals, because it's so direct and straightforward, but actually there's a lot of artistry behind it and a lot of thought behind it. So about intonation, and I think the next piece is probably a good one to listen for that. I remember him talking, showing one of his students in the classes how every note on the C string, if you played it with just the right sonority and in exactly the right place, that you could hear the overtones very strongly. So that D on the C string, and it has a very strong ring on the A string, and F has a very strong ring on in the A, I think it's the A up two A's above middle C, and E has an E ringing, high E ringing, B flat has a D ringing, and so on and so on. And you only actually get these overtones clearly. You can make them ring out incredibly clearly from the instrument if you're bang on in the right place of your instrument in relation to how you've tuned the strings, but also if the sonority is right. And I feel this is a sort of core to his sonority, which is connected with that you hear the overtones really ringing and contributing to the sound. But having said that, he was the last person to think that there was a keyboard type geography on the fingerboard, which you just had to learn to put your fingers down, because he was so aware of semitones changing their position according to the relationship to the sound, so that a flattened sixth or a flattened second would be a low semitone, and the leading note, and sometimes often the third, especially if you're going up, would be a higher note. So that the only fixed notes for him were the tonic, the subdominant, and the dominant, and the other notes were variable according to their relationship within the harmony, and the harmony and the melodic line. And he always thought people were playing tune when they were actually playing piano intonation, because he couldn't bear it. And when he played with the piano, he nevertheless played his way. And somehow the mind, I think for me, that's the right thing to do. The mind separates out the intonation of the cello and the intonation of the piano and makes it right. So there was no kind of adjusting to the piano when he did that. I think in the next piece we will hear sort of semitones which were, a clear examples of that. So the intonation is not a mechanical thing for him, it's part of the expression. It's just it's part of what is conveying the music. And he's completely in control of it. I mean, he might have the odd accident occasionally, very occasionally, but the intonation is far more exact than being in the right semitone. Shall we have a listen? I don't know if it's the same for all of us, but for me, Zoom allowed us to listen to that in quite a good, with quite good sound. Was that the same? Yeah, good. Okay, so I mean, I think there were many semitones which illustrated my point. I mean, they're not exaggerated, but they're just not where the piano would play those notes, and they really add the minor six and the leading notes being sharp and so on. They really add to the expressive meaning of what he's doing. Another thing I remember him saying actually is, this is about ornaments and trills. That he said a trill or an ornament is an exaltation of the note. I just thought it was such a wonderful expression. I mean, English was about his third or fourth language. It wasn't particularly a strong language for him, but he did have some wonderful expressions like that. Okay, any more reactions?
Becky.
Hello. Yeah, I was going to mention about the trills and the decorations, which sound so sort of pianistic in a way. I was really struck by the Chopin, which I'd never heard, certainly never in an arrangement like that. So, you know, to steal like the best piano music, so you have to do it sort of pianistically in a way like that with that much clarity. But it's amazing how expressive he is, but how not indulgent he is at the same time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, interesting about the pianistic quality, because he doesn't articulate usually, unless he really means to, by any sort of portato in the bow, by changing the bow pressure for every note. But he does it very much in his left hand, and he taught his students to banging and plucking, as he called it, which meant basically when you were going up the scale, he would actually bang the fingers down, and he would teach people to practice scales without using the bow at all, because you can get, I mean, it's harder on the violin, but it particularly works on the cello, and it can work on the violin, that if the fingers go down with a certain élan, and then also just slightly relax, so it's not like a mallet going down, it's like a mallet with a rubber end to it. It creates, I mean, the instrument resonates. And so his first notes always have a sort of enunciation, which is so clear, even when they're strong upbeats, they're strongly enunciated. And that comes from the finger going down sort of with the bow. And when you're coming down the scale, you pluck off. So instead of the finger going upwards away from the fingerboard, it goes a little bit sideways so that you can pluck the string as you come off. And I think particularly when he's playing faster notes in an ornament, he's always doing that. So that the articulation, that the diction of those short notes, little notes, is incredibly clear. But on the other hand, in the bow, it's just shaping a phrase, and it's not digging out every note to make it heard. And for me, this is a much better way of doing it than the trouble is, if you're spinning your bow, digging out every note, then the bow ceases to have a shape. It's not shaping a phrase anymore by varying in bow speed. And you can hear it very clearly in a lot of his playing what he's doing.
Maybe that's how he has so much control over the rhythm as well. The rhythm,
Yes,
always have so much direction. He's often on the front of the beat, or just anticipating things. So.
yes, he does sometimes. He sometimes anticipates and sometimes goes behind. I mean, he's very flexibly.
Yeah.
He's clearly aware of the piano all the time, but his awareness doesn't mean he's bang on all the time by any means. I think all the pianists are playing beautifully in this. Some of them are not even named on the YouTube, sadly. But the one called Blasnet, who does a lot of these with him, is I don't know anything about him, and I wish I did. And he played with many pianists. He played with Tovey and Courtauld and Harold Bauer very often. He loved chamber music. Of course, he had his incredible trio with Courtauld and Thibaut, and there are a few wonderful recordings of Schubert and Beethoven and Schumann, and so on. And he'd also, as a young man, played in orchestra. So I haven't really talked about this, but he was a very all-round musician. He played the piano well. He was a wonderful conductor, and he composed oratorios and would then conduct them. He was a very all-round musician in a way that 19th century musicians often were, just about always were. And we've lost that. We're sort of divided, most of us, between players or composers or or conductors. There are rarely people who do it all. Although I see Pratzer, who's a shining example of a 19th century player composer. Yes. Now the next piece, Song of the Birds, needs a little bit of background. It's based on a Catalan folk song, which Casals arranged and altered the character somewhat, because he plays it as a very yearning, sad piece, which I don't think the original is. But it's become that, because Casals' version of it has become so dominant. Casals had a very, very active musical life, playing with many people and traveling and playing everywhere in a way that was normal in those days and in nowadays. But he, in the Spanish Civil War in the mid-30s, he, partly being, he was born in Vedrell, which is near Barcelona, so he's Catalonian, and partly just being by instinct, of course, liberal and democratic, was a great opponent of the Franco-fascists. And when the Franco-fascists won that civil war, Casals swore that he would never return to Spain until Franco had gone. And unfortunately, Casals died before Franco went, so he never went back to Spain. So he went to live in a small village in France, just on the border, near the border of Spain, called Prades, P-R-A-D-E-S, which is part of the Catalonian part of France. And more drastically even than that, he said he would refuse to play in any country which recognized Franco. And he was desperately hurt and disappointed after the end of the Second World War and after the fall of Hitler and Mussolini and so on, that the great powers tolerated Franco and recognized Franco as the leader of Spain. And Casals was horrified by that. And so he refused to play virtually anywhere he became silent in 45, even though he lived till 1973. And just lived at home and practiced. He had a routine. Actually, it reminds me of being in lockdown, in isolation, because he wasn't really traveling anywhere and he was seeing very few people. And his routine was he would go and have a long walk in the morning and then play some Bach preludes and fugues on the piano. And then he would do some slow scales on the cello, and then he would have breakfast, and then he would play a Bach suite. And he would go through them all, one every day. And then when he got to the 7th day, he would repeat the 6th week because it's so difficult. And then he would go back to his routine. But he wasn't performing. Anyway, sometime later, when musicians were desperate to play with him and hear him again, they came on a sort of deputation to him and said, look, if you won't come to us, we will come to you. And so they persuaded him to set up a festival in Prague, which was called the Prague Festival, and ran for many years. And all the major players of his time would come to Prague and play together and play with him. We have many recordings of these performances from the Prague Festival. In old-fashioned speak, there are many box sets of different years of the festival. And Casals playing some duo work and some and mainly trios and quartets and even a Schubert quintet here and there. And then he played a little bit in Puerto Rico. He would visit Puerto Rico because his mother came from there. He wasn't playing there, but he was teaching there, and which is where he met his wife Martita, who I think was his 3rd wife. And then the festival started there as well. I think he made an exception. And then he also made, he was very impressed with JF Kennedy, and he agreed to play in the White House at the invitation of Kennedy. So whenever he played these concerts, he made a habit of always ending with the Song of the Birds, this Catalan folk song. And it has all his natural elements that sort of suit him playing a folk song so well. I mean, the directness of the utterance, the enunciation, the speaking, the heartfelt yearning of it. And there are many versions of this. And one thing I'd urge you to do is, we don't have time for that now, but if you look up Casals speaking in the United Nations, towards the very end of his life, he was honoured by the United Nations for his stance against fascism. And as a very old man, he was there, and he'd stopped playing really for 3 or 4 years, and he played Song of the Birds there. And unfortunately, Martita's taken it down, which I think is a shame. She won't let it be heard, because he basically couldn't really play the cello very well by then, and yet everything comes through. It's just a matter of gestures and utterance, and although he can barely play, it comes over so incredibly well. It's incredibly moving to hear someone who's struggling so much on the instrument, but yet it didn't matter. He could say everything he had to say. But anyway, what you can see still is a speech he made to the United Nations as a very old man about Catalonia and about peace and about freedom. And it's very wonderful and and moving. Anyway, the version we're going to hear now is an earlier version. On the piano is the wonderful pianist Horozovsky, who he played often with, and I think his best version of the Beethoven sonatas is with Horozovsky. There's a later one with Sirkin, but Horozovsky was playing till well over the age of 100. I heard him in the Wigmore Hall when he was about 100 years old, and he was one of Casals' major piano partners. There's very little for the piano to do in this, as you will hear, but the way he just opens it is the best introduction I've ever heard. Anyway, here is Song of the Birds. What can one say? So that ended every concert, and yeah. So yeah, sorry, I keep talking way too much. Tell me what to. Actually, can I ask Pao, as you share a name? I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you know that as a folk song?
Yes, yes. I'm actually from Barcelona, so
Yeah.
so this is actually very much so sing in Christmas. It's like a carol, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah.
The lyrics are very appropriate for Christmas time. But
So it's normally, am I right in thinking it's quite a hopeful, I mean, is it normally sung faster than that?
faster, I'm not sure. I think Casals, in a way, everybody follows now a bit the
Yes.
interpretation of Casals. I don't know
Yeah.
back then, but because I was brought up already with this tradition.
Yeah. Yes. And actually, just about the name, because you often see Casals called Pau Casals, which is the Catalan version of Pablo, and especially now when Catalonia is such a sort of live issue again. But his mother called him Pablo. He called himself Pablo. He signed his name Pablo, and his playing name was Pablo. So although he was very identified with Catalonia, there's no doubt that Pablo was the version of his name that he used.
Yeah, I think because internationally as well, people know much more Pablo or what Pablo means than Pablo. I mean, I remember when I came first in England and I was introducing myself with Pau, and they said, "Oh, does it not have a translation?" I said, "Well, it's like Paul or Pablo in Spanish." So, but even I've been asked if I forgot the L at the end of my name.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So I suspect that's why he signed as Pablo, because internationally was much more common to know the name than Pau.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, his mother also called him Pablo, so he was brought up like that. I don't know why. Well, I don't know about that. But then she was Puerto Rican, I think. Maybe had something to do with that. Anyway, just looking at the time, I'm wondering if we should maybe miss out the Schumann and play the Beethoven, which is the first piece actually written for cello and piano, which we're hearing, and it's a little bit longer. It's only about 8 or 9 minutes. It's by Menon, the variation that was on Mozart's Magic Flute aria by Menon, and it's with Cortot, who was an absolutely great pianist who Casals played a lot of sonata recitals with, and trios with Thibaut, and I think it's and again it's variations which need huge amount of characterization for each variation, which I think you'll hear there is. But maybe we'll end with that. But before we do that, are there any? I'm just looking at questions. I've not been very good at this. I noticed there's it's a comment actually from Peter Eswood saying, yes, his trills are so vocal. I can't remember hearing trills this fast. It's so like the human voice, and that's so right. I think everything is so vocal. I mean, you know, everything about his utterance and his speech and his and what he does with his long notes is above all vocal. I mean, I just feel he's singing to himself while he plays. But yes, the trills are spectacularly expressive as well. Yes. Anyone else like to make any? Yes, Jenna.
Hello. Let's see.
We've lost you, Jenna.
I think, can you hear me now? Great. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are just incredible. Thank you so much, David. This is lifting the spirits. I was really struck actually by the beautiful downward shifts and the portamenti, because that's not something that you really hear done much today.
No, it's
and I
true.
found
it. Yes. Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, I'm having some sound problems. Can you say that again?
We can hear you. It's fine.
Yeah. No, go on. Go on.
Pratchett's off somehow.
No, you
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. I just didn't hear your response. Sorry about
Right,
that.
okay.
I should be a pro at this by now.
Um,
I didn't hear your response. I was just saying how beautiful I found the downward shifts, because it's not something that you hear people do much today. And I think that's maybe a shame that we've lost that from our vocabulary.
yes, that's one thing. Is it's very vocal, isn't it? A downward shift.
Yeah.
But I think there are so many different varieties. Actually, Menuhin said of his teacher Enescu, who's an absolutely wonderful violinist who would merit one of these sessions, that he had hundreds of ways of doing shifts. I mean, there were different techniques and different combinations of techniques, but mainly the shift comes from, like everything else, just comes from inside, and you find a way of doing it which is just appropriate to that particular interval. So, again, like the vibrato and like the sound quality, there are infinite numbers of different ways of doing these things. But I agree, it's very notable and beautiful.
And I had a question. It sounded to me like most of those downward shifts were probably same finger shifts. Is that the case? Because I've noticed in looking at some old editions that you see Joachim and David and some of these old violinists who had, of course, been before Casals, but closer to them than we are.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of one finger shifts, even on the same finger, up and down several notes, and
yes,
a very different way of expressing a line.
I think there are all sorts, and there's a lot going on in the bow as well, which is moderating what one hears. The length of it, the heaviness of it, the lightness of it, the amount of it, and also, I mean, I think Casals was very. He was one of the first people to cut a lot of the unmusical shifting out of the playing of his time, and he I'm not sure if he invented it, but he very much made famous the sort of whole idea of extending, doing fingerings by extending and stretching, and cutting out a lot of unnecessary shifting by just by his fingerings, which were new. And so he was very aware of not wanting to shift unless he really meant it. But when he did shift, it wasn't just a shift, it was one of an infinite variety of shifts that he would do.
Well, you alluded to this earlier, but I watched a masterclass last week and heard someone say about that shifting was the window into the soul for a string player, and it's very given the topic today. So I just leave.
Yes, absolutely, and for a singer. And amazingly, I mean, the poor pianist can't do this, but a great pianist gives you a sense of shifting, just the gap between the length of the interval and the timing, and somehow the touch can give us a sense of that stretch of an interval, which is what a shift is about, even without actually hearing the join. But of course, we're lucky enough to be able to make the join as well. So, let's play Beethoven by men and variations, Casals and I've lost my screen. No, here we are. Casals and Kurto. So, yeah, any responses? Yes.
Lisa.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for all of this. It's very exciting. Um, I mean, first of all, the piano playing here was, I thought, incredible.
Absolutely.
Amazing. And I just thought, because maybe perhaps because this piece was more classical and kind of more vertical, whether here there was totally different qualities coming through. Of course, still the singing lines were coming through, but I mean, he had very little chance to almost go to different places, and yet sometimes there will be one note that will hint at the minor, and he'll just color that note incredibly, or things like that. But also, I was wondering about the strings as a gut string geek myself, because would he have started first on gut strings in his life?
Yes.
Presumably. Yeah.
He played on gut strings nearly all his life. He played on gut strings. I think at the very end, he sometimes reluctantly went to metal. I'm not sure why he felt he had to do that. But all the recordings we're hearing are on gut strings, as one can tell, really. Yeah. You couldn't make that. You could not make that. So you make those colours on metal strings.
And I was just thinking about, because people were saying earlier about the different registers, and here obviously the bass register was incredible, but also the articulation in the faster variations where he was just kind of picking at the cello, just that concentration of bow stroke that can only happen, I think, really on a gut string, like when you're really close to the bridge, just kind of biting. Yeah, it was just so satisfying to hear that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll shut up now, but thank you very much. It's very good.
Keep going. No, absolutely. In fact, one of the... sorry, does anyone else?
Yeah, so Pablo.
Yeah.
Oh. Hello? Oh,
I just wanted to remark that at the beginning, it's amazing, like the communication they have, because you can actually see who got the main theme, and basically this will come up so much. And I realized there was some bass line as well on the piano, and then on like at that time I think the cello is doing accompaniment or something, and that bass line is the main line, so they are kind of playing together. So how the right, left hand and cello part combined together was incredible. And I was wondering, because I saw I think there are some master classes or some short classes by Cortot of piano playing, but as well, like I would tell that they have like this kind of poetic approach always whenever they attempt to play a piece, that they try to go beyond as well what is printed, and try to give even like a sense of lyrical or sense to like trying of building a history behind the music, which makes the performer like believe in what they are playing, no, like to be more attached to what they are doing. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. But.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm sure the trio and the duo as well, I mean, they never started from the point of view of ensemble or any of those kind of teamwork, technical things.
Yeah.
It was of no interest to them at all. And there are lots of things which are not, you know, where they're not coordinating completely the way they play phrases, but they're responding, and they really believed in playing things their own way and vive la différence, and as long as it made sense in the end. And I mean, of course, they're incredibly aware of each other. Yeah, I mean, do listen to the whole set of Beethoven sonatas with Horozovsky. I think the A major, for some reason which I don't know, is not with Horozovsky. It's with a pianist called Otto Schulhoff. But it's wonderful. I think he's a wonderful Beethoven player, actually. Pratt.
It's interesting, the conversation about gut strings, because I think things seem to have sort of turned full circle, as you mentioned the Horshovsky. How do you say his name? Horshovsky?
Something like that.
Something like that. I never learned the SZ in Polish.
Yes.
Well, interestingly, he was one of the world's first forte pianists, because he recorded Giustini Sonata on the first on Cristofori piano in the 70s. I can't quite remember when, and he was very much interested in all this.
Yes,
I do agree with you, David, that there is a quality that is always searching in both their partnership.
Yes, it's amazing about that. I didn't know that about Horozovsky, but when I heard him play live, I mean, it was an approach to the piano in terms of sonority which was utterly new for me, and it was extraordinary and wonderful. And the only time I heard something like it was when I played with a modern pianist in the Hatchlands Museum of Pianos, which you probably know. And I was playing with my quartet. We were playing a Brahms quartet, and we played it with a Brahms piano, and exactly a piano contemporary with when Brahms wrote the quintet. And this pianist, who doesn't normally sound at all like that, sounded like Horozovsky playing on that piano. It instantly reminded me of Horozovsky, just this quality of the bass, and it was a completely different. I think it was an early Steinway, as far as I remember, but a completely different sort of Steinway from the 20th century Steinway. Is that possible that it was an early Steinway?
Yeah, it's probably.
Yeah.
Steinway. Yeah. They don't have so many 19th century pianos down there. But anyway, this is about cello. So.
Yeah. Well, it's about music. There are some questions that have been written out, and I'll try and answer them. Casals has left a legacy in cello playing for future generations, but who was his influence? He said when asked how long it took him to learn the cello, his response was a lifetime and more. I don't know. I mean, I don't. It's not because it's not known. It's because I'm ignorant. But I know he learnt extraordinarily quickly. I think his father taught him a lot about music and singing, and he played several instruments and piano and one of the wind instruments and so on. And he didn't see a cello till he was about 10 years old from a traveling troupe of players. And his father made him one because he immediately fell in love with it out of a good and something straight and a couple of strings, and that's what he learnt on. And I think he was about 10 or 11 by then. By the time he was I think he gave his first recital about 2 years later, and about 2 years after that, he was heard playing in a cafe by Albéniz, who recommended him to the Queen, who was of Spain, who was a patron of the arts. And from then on, he had a certain amount of support. So clearly within 3 or 4 years, he'd almost taught himself the cello to a very high level. So I don't think his biggest influence was any sort of local teacher. But if I'm remembering rightly, I think he talks about Isai as being a major influence, and of course Joachim. There's a story about Horozovsky being asked when he was over 100 years, who's the greatest musician you've ever heard play, and he'd heard all the modern players and so on, and he immediately said, "Oh, Casals, of course." And then he said, "No, it's Joachim." So maybe we should do Joachim. But Joachim's such a fundamental figure because, I mean, not only, of course, was he so connected with Brahms, as we all know, but he played the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto with Mendelssohn conducting. And there's a wonderful little article by Joachim which says all the points that Mendelssohn made to him sort of during that tour playing the concerto. And going back a bit further, Mendelssohn's teacher, I always forget the name, was it Helmersberger, was someone who taught Schubert the violin and played quartets to Beethoven. So I mean, there are such close connections from Beethoven to Joachim, and such close connections from Joachim to several 20th century figures like his great nieces, Yeli Darani, Adila Fakiri, who were great friends of my teacher, Jane Cowan, and Shandor Vague, of course, who had lessons with Hubai, who played the Brahms sonatas with Brahms and so on. So, I mean, even getting down to second half of the 20th century, there were fairly close connections with these people. So Casals, I don't know for sure, but I mean, I'm sure Joachim would have been an enormous influence, and Isai as well. And there are no doubt others. I mean, singing seems to have been a major influence for him as well. So I'm sorry not to know more about that, but there are lots of biographies and memoirs and so on, given that he lived to such a ripe age until October 1973, so one could probably find out. Graham, hello, Graham Waterhouse. Who says he never widened the intervals for trills. Like violinists, which can appear contrived. I think Graham, he did talk about widening intervals for trills. It's just that he doesn't overdo it, and it's probably very different. And it's very different for a semitone trill and a whole tone trill. So I think for whole tone trills, he probably, I think he does mean to anyway. And for semitone trills, he probably, because of talking about the narrow semitone, that he probably wouldn't. Marion Balkwell, what is his cello and where is it now? Good question. I think there were, I don't really know the answer. There were 2 or 3 cellos he played on in his career. One of them kept getting touted round the dealers, and I was sometimes told the Casals Tononi was for sale, and the price was inflated by about £50,000 because Casals had played it. It didn't. I tried it and it didn't really work because it had been in some major accidents, and anyone who thought they were going to sound like Casals by playing the Tononi Casals was sorely disappointed. But more than that, I don't know. That there will be people who know. And Steve Banks is saying, what was he like as a person? So I think in some ways there was a great simplicity. He loved nature, he loved the countryside, he loved walking. He adored anything to do with music and was interested in the other arts and philosophy. I think he was companionable and friendly. He was quite mischievous sometimes, but he also had an enormous integrity and stubbornness and obstinacy, which is often the same thing. of course, this came out in his refusal to play, which was a huge self-sacrifice as well as a sacrifice because of Franco. There are also stories about him. The story that he was playing, I can't remember, recording or just performing Dvorak concerto with a conductor who made some slightly disparaging remark about the work not being a wonderful work, and he just put his cello down and refused to play it with him. End of concert. It didn't happen. And there's a recording of, there's actually a rather wonderful recording, the first two movements of Haydn D major concerto. The third movement was never done because it was a similar falling out with a conductor during the sessions. So we've got the first two movements, but there ain't a third movement, unfortunately, not from those sessions. I recently came across a different version, which is, I think, from a broadcast or something. So yes, very, very stubborn in his integrity, but in personal terms, I mean, there was also a huge falling out with Curto, which was difficult for all of them because Casals regarded Curto as being behaving feebly during the war compared to what Casals was doing. They made up in the very end, and there's a very poignant last concert with the two of them getting together again. The Beethoven A major is on that, and I know from, well, I've heard indirectly from Casals' wife that Curto could hardly play. I mean, he was so emotional, and he hadn't been playing for ages, and Casals was very worried during the afternoon, after the rehearsal earlier, that he would never be able to do it, but actually somehow it comes to life miraculously in the performance. That is, I think, on YouTube. Yes. Oh, there's more now. Sophia, hello. Yes, very interesting about the Bimenen variations. Not really about Casals, but it is interesting. The Mozart, the manuscript of Bimenen variations, he carefully rebarred the whole thing. So in the first version in which he composed it, the bar line was, I think, where you'd expect it, which is dum ba rum bum ba rum bo yo da 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 rum, all the way through. And then he carefully goes all the way through and rebars it so that the bar line comes in I'm not sure I'm getting this right, but dum ba rum bum ba rum da 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 dum dum bum, so that I'm showing where the bar lines are, which is not, which is fascinating that he could conceive it and compose it in one way and then decide the barring was in another way. And I wish I understood more about that. Beethoven adopts I don't know if Beethoven knew about the original version, but Beethoven adopts the second version. And I think most people hearing it in most performances would imagine that the bar line is where Mozart originally put the bar lines. Bruno Schrecker, hello Bruno, he was always changing the fingerings and bowings but never improvised. Well, I studied the D minor suite with him, and he asked me why I did a certain fingering. Because you did it last week, I said. That was last week, he said. That was a lesson for life. Thank you for that, Bruno. Bruno, a colleague from, for many, many, many years, the cellist of the Allegri Quartet, with Richard's father, Patrick. So it's wonderful to have all these, this input. Anyway, thank you. It's 20 to 10. I'm sorry it's gone on and on, but it's wonderful to share this with you. And thank you very much for putting up with it and listening to me and listening on this not very good sound system to Casals, but enough comes through that I hope you're inspired to listen to a lot else.